The storm dragon landed in the ruins of Ashford Keep on a Tuesday morning, which was, Sir Edric Vane reflected, an inconvenient day for the world to change. He had been in the middle of inventory, a thoroughly unglamorous occupation for a Knight of the Crown's Second Order, but necessary given that the Order's Ashford garrison had dwindled over the past decade from 32 knights to 7, and the 7 remaining had developed what their commander generously called a flexible relationship with supply requisitions. Edric was the youngest of them at 34, which meant the inventory fell to him by the logic of institutional seniority that placed the worst tasks firmly in the hands of those least positioned to argue about it. He heard the landing before he saw it, a sound like a cathedral collapsing in slow motion, a deep percussion that moved through the stone floor of the keep and up through the solace of his boots and into his chest, before his ears had quite processed what it was. He dropped the manifest ledger and was through the door and into the courtyard before he'd consciously decided to move. The dragon filled most of the courtyard. It was not the largest dragon Edric had seen. That distinction belonged to the ancient bronze that sometimes soared the coastal thermals above, Port Calais, visible as a distant copper glint against the sea-gray sky. But the bronze was always far away and going somewhere else, which gave a person room to manage their response to it. This dragon was here, immediate, occupying the same physical space as Edric and the 6 other knights who had emerged from various corners of the garrison with weapons half-drawn and expressions of concentrated professional alarm. It was storm gray, a color that was not quite silver and not quite blue, but something between that shifted as it moved. The way storm clouds shifted, never quite the same twice, never static. Its scales had the wet-like quality of rain-soaked slate. Its wingspan, currently half-folded, suggested a spread that would have shaded the entire courtyard. And its eyes, large pale, the color of the sky an hour before lightning, were oriented not on the armed knights around it but on the keep itself, moving across the stone walls and the old carvings above the gate, and the particular arrangement of the garrison's layout with an expression that Edric, who had spent 3 years studying the behavioral signatures of large magical creatures as part of his order training, could only describe as searching. It was looking for something specific and intent, the way a person looks for a familiar face in a crowd. "Hold," Edric said, quietly, but with the particular quality of command that stopped people before they did things they couldn't undo. The other 6 knights held. Hands stayed on hilts. Nobody moved. The dragon's searching gaze swept the courtyard once more, and stopped. On the crest above the garrison's main gate, an old carving, weathered by a century of wind and rain, a knight on horseback, beside a rearing dragon, their proportions equal, their postures neither dominant nor submissive, but simply present together. The garrison's founding seal. Edric had passed under it every day for 4 years without thinking about it particularly. The dragon looked at that carving for a long time. Then it sat down. Not the controlled descent of a predator taking a position, but the sudden, slightly awkward movement of a creature whose legs had simply decided they were done holding it up. A sound came from it that Edric's training catalogued automatically as a distress vocalization, low and resonant and too complex to be simple animal pain. It was the sound of something that had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had run out of strength for it. Edric took his hand off his sword hilt. He walked forward across the courtyard, alone, while behind him he heard Sergeant Aldrich making a sound of profound professional objection that he chose not to acknowledge. He stopped 10 feet from the dragon's lowered head and looked up at those pale lightning-colored eyes, which had moved from the carving to him with a quality he recognized with sudden, disorienting clarity. Recognition, not of him specifically, he was certain of that. Recognition of something about him, something he represented or carried or wore. The Order's crest on his surcoat, perhaps. The Ashford garrison's colors. Something. "You've been here before," Edric said. Not a question. The dragon's great head moved, the smallest possible motion, the barest inclination forward, which in a creature of this size communicated something enormous. "A long time ago," it said. Its voice was low and layered, the way thunder was layered, not one sound but many sounds arriving at different speeds, the closest ones immediate and the furthest ones still rolling in from somewhere far. Its common was precise but carried beneath it the faint structural echo of Draconic, the way an accent carries the shape of a first language. "I remember the seal." "I remember." It paused. The pale eyes moved back to the carving above the gate. "I remember that I should remember more than I do. Edric stood in the courtyard of Ashford Keep on a Tuesday morning, with 6 nervous knights at his back and a storm dragon in front of him that had arrived looking for something it had lost, and felt the particular quality of attention that preceded discoveries, the held-breath moment before a door opened onto a room nobody had entered in a very long time. "Tell me what you remember," he said. Her name was Varreth. She offered it simply, without the full draconic formal designation that older dragons used when dealing with creatures they considered beneath their time, which told Edric something, though he wasn't certain yet what. She had been flying for 11 days. She had come from the eastern range, the high peaks above the Thornwood, where she had spent what she described with careful precision as a very long time sleeping. "How long?" Edric asked. "I don't know," Varreth said. "That is part of what I don't know." They were in the garrison's great hall, Varreth's head and neck inside through the main doors, which had been opened to their fullest extent, the rest of her in the courtyard behind. It was not a dignified arrangement, but it was functional, and Varreth had accepted it with the practicality of a creature focused on more pressing concerns than architecture. The other 6 knights had retreated to the hall's far end with what Edric privately considered admirable composure, given the circumstances. Sergeant Aldrich had produced a ledger and was taking notes with the focused diligence of a man who had decided that documentation was a reasonable response to the inexplicable. Edric had sent for the garrison's archive boxes. They arrived carried by 2 junior knights who set them on the central table and retreated quickly. The boxes held 40 years of accumulated records, garrison logs, order correspondence, historical transcriptions, maps. Edric opened the oldest box first. "Walk me through what you do remember," he said. "In order if you can." Varreth was quiet for a moment. The pale eyes had the quality of someone looking at a room through frosted glass, shapes visible, details lost. "The keep," she said. "The original keep before." She paused. "It was smaller. The south tower was intact. There was a knight who wore this crest." Her gaze moved briefly to the order insignia on Edric's surcoat. "Not this knight, another, a long time before you." A pause. "We had an agreement, a formal bond. I remember the shape of it, the weight of it, but not the substance. Not the terms. Not the name." Edric opened the garrison log from 40 years prior. Standard entries, patrol records, supply tallies, the ordinary accumulation of an active garrison. He moved to the older transcription box, the one that held records copied from documents too fragile to handle directly. He found what he was looking for on the 14th page of a transcription dated to records approximately 120 years old. Asterisk the Storm Compact. Established in the 3rd year of Commander Edric Vane's tenure at Ashford Keep. A formal bond of mutual recognition between the Ashford garrison of the Crown's Second Order and the Storm Dragon, Varreth of the Eastern Range, hereafter designated as Warden of the Thornwood Passes. Terms: Varreth to maintain patrol of the eastern passes and alert the garrison to incursions from the range. The garrison to maintain Varreth's sanctuary rights within the keep's territory and a record of her name in the garrison's founding seal. Bond renewed by the presence of both parties. Duration: indefinite, subject to renewal. Asterisk Edric read it twice. Then he looked up. "Edric Vane," he said, carefully. "Yes," Varreth said. She had heard him reading. The pale eyes were very still. "That name. That is, yes. He was my grandfather's grandfather," Edric said. "He commanded this garrison for 19 years. He's the knight in the founding seal." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture, full of things arriving from different distances. The way Varreth's voice was full of layered thunder. Something was resolving in the dragon's pale eyes. The frosted glass quality shifting as shapes that had been blurred began to find their edges. "The bond was never formally dissolved," Edric said slowly, reading further down the transcription. "There's a note here, Commander Vane's final entry before he retired. He intended to arrange a renewal of the compact with his successor, but he found the relevant line. His successor was transferred from another garrison and unfamiliar with the arrangement. There's no record of the renewal taking place." "I waited," Varreth said. The words carried a weight that had nothing to do with their simplicity. "For a long time I waited. And then," she stopped. "I don't remember when I stopped waiting. I don't remember going east. I remember the peaks. I remember sleeping." The pale eyes moved to the carving above the garrison gate, visible through the open doors. "I remember that I should come back. That was all that remained. Edric set the transcription down carefully and looked at the dragon who had flown 11 days on the remnant of a 100-and-20-year-old promise, guided by the last thread of a bond that had never been properly ended, and therefore had never quite let her go. "The South Tower," he said. "You mentioned it was intact when you were here before." "Yes. It collapsed 80 years ago." He paused. "In a storm?" "The records say it was an unusual storm, localized, very intense. Didn't follow the seasonal pattern. Varreth was very still." "I didn't know," she said, at last. "I didn't know I had." She stopped. "I was already east." "You didn't cause it," Edric said, firmly and clearly, because this was the kind of moment where firmness mattered. "The records are specific. The storm came from the sea. It predated your compact's eastern boundary by 40 miles. He held her gaze steadily. "You didn't cause it." The great head lowered, very slightly. The sound that came from her was the same low resonance as before, but different in quality. Not distress, this time. Something that had been held at tension for an extremely long time, beginning very carefully to release. "There is more to find," Edric said. "The compact's full terms. What was agreed. What was meant." He looked at the archive boxes, then at the dragon whose pale eyes were, for the first time since she had landed, looking at him rather than through him. "This will take time. I have been asleep for..." Varreth paused. "A great deal of time. I think I can manage a little more." "Good," Edric said. He pulled the next archive box toward him and opened it. "Then let's begin." The archive work took 8 days. And by the end of it, Edric had developed a working familiarity with the handwriting of 7 different garrison commanders, a detailed knowledge of the eastern passes that no living cartographer possessed, and a persistent ache in his lower back from the combination of long hours at the garrison table and sleeping on a cot so that Varreth could use the great hall, without being confined to the courtyard in the cold. Sergeant Aldrich, a solidly practical man named Oswin, no relation to the historical commander whose name had startled the dragon, and who had adjusted to the presence of a storm dragon in his garrison with the resigned professionalism of someone who had long suspected his career would eventually produce something like this, had organized the other 5 knights into a rotation that kept the garrison functional while the archive work continued. He had also quietly and without being asked begun leaving a portion of the garrison's weekly livestock allocation near the garrison's eastern gate each morning, which Varreth accepted without comment but which Edric noticed she ate consistently and completely. The compact's full terms emerged gradually, assembled from cross-references across a dozen different documents, the original, the first renewal, notes from 3 subsequent renewals, and a lengthy personal correspondence between Commander Edric Vane and the Order's regional headquarters in which Vane had argued, with considerable passion and moderate diplomatic success, for the formal recognition of the Storm Compact as a precedent-setting example of non-hostile draconic relations. The terms were more extensive than the brief transcription had suggested. Varreth had not merely been an early warning system for the Eastern Passes. She had been their guardian, actively, physically, in ways that the garrison's human patrols could not replicate. The eastern range of the Thornwood was riddled with pass routes that changed seasonally, some becoming impassable with snow, others opening in summer that were invisible in winter. Varreth knew every one. She had guided garrison patrols through the range for years, had warned of 3 separate incursion attempts from the range's far side, had located 2 garrison members lost in a winter storm, a detail that appeared in Commander Vane's correspondence with a warmth that transcended official report language. "You remember any of this?" Edric asked on the 6th evening, reading from Vane's correspondence by lamplight, while Varreth's head rested on the hall's stone floor a few feet away, her eyes tracking the pages he held. "More each day," she said. The frosted glass quality had been clearing steadily, not all at once, but incrementally, as each new document provided a name or a detail that pulled another thread loose from whatever had sealed the memories away. The passes, yes, the smell of them in different seasons. The patrol routes, a pause. The lost soldiers. I remember their faces. They were very cold and very frightened and very relieved. The record says you carried them back. It seemed the fastest option. The pale eyes held a quality that Edric had come to recognize as her version of dry humor, subtle, easily missed, present. If you were paying attention, they were not entirely comfortable with the arrangement. I imagine not. They were grateful afterward. Also recorded, Edric confirmed. He set the correspondence down and looked at her directly. The passes. Is the knowledge still there? Yes, no hesitation. The passes don't change in ways that matter. The seasonal routes, the hidden approaches, the places where the rock faces look solid but aren't, I know them as well as I knew them then. A pause. Better. I have had a great deal of time to think about them. Edric absorbed this. He had been building toward a question for 3 days, arriving at it from different angles, testing it for the places where it might give way. He asked it now, because 8 days of archive work had taught him that Varreth valued directness above almost everything else. The compact was never renewed. It was never dissolved either. Legally, under the Order's charter, an unrenewed compact doesn't expire. It lapses into dormancy. He met her gaze. Which means it can be renewed. By any garrison commander of Second Order rank. You are not a garrison commander, Varreth said. Not objection, observation. Reading the situation the way she read the passes, mapping the terrain before moving through it. I'm the senior officer present, which under field conditions gives me provisional command authority. He paused. It's a reasonable, legal interpretation. How reasonable? My grandfather's grandfather would have said very reasonable. The regional headquarters would have said debatable. He paused again. I am inclined to agree with my grandfather's grandfather. The pale eyes studied him with a particular quality of assessment that he had stopped finding unsettling around the 4th day and had started finding clarifying, the sense of being read accurately, without inference, or assumption, which was rarer in human company than it should have been. There is something else, Varreth said. In the passes, something that was not there before. Edric went still. What kind of something? I flew the eastern boundary when I came west, she said. I wasn't entirely present. The instinct to return was stronger than my awareness at that point. But I remember she paused, and the pause had the quality of someone reaching for something they'd set down in a dark room. Movement, large, organized, in the Thornwood's upper reaches, where the passes narrow. The back of Edric's neck registered this with the specific alertness that long training produced in response to certain categories of information. Organized movement, he said. You're certain? I am certain of the difference between animals moving through terrain and a column moving through terrain, Varreth said. I am a warden of the Thornwood Passes. She said the title with a quiet precision that was not quite pride and not quite sorrow, but carried the weight of both. I know what organized movement in those passes looks like. Edric was already standing, moving toward the garrison's map cabinet. Show me, he said. And Varreth, whose memories of the passes were returning day by day and whose sense of what she was and what she had promised was returning with them, told him everything she had seen. It was as Edric had suspected from the moment she described the movement as organized, considerably more than a routine patrol situation. The Thornwood's upper passes connected, through 3 seasonal routes that appeared on no garrison map Edric had ever seen, to a stretch of lowland that ran directly toward Calder's Ford, a river crossing. That was, in summer, the single most viable route into the kingdom's interior from the eastern range. Summer was 6 weeks away. They went into the Thornwood on the 9th day, at first light, with Edric on the back of his garrison horse, Bramble, a reliable gray who had the considerable virtue of not panicking in the presence of large predators, a trait Edric had specifically selected, and which was now proving its worth in circumstances beyond what he had originally anticipated, and Varreth moving through the high air above, her storm gray scales invisible against the overcast sky when she chose to be invisible, audible only, as the faintest displacement of wind when she passed directly overhead. They had spent the night before in planning, with the garrison's map spread across the great hall table and Varreth correcting it from memory, in ways that rendered approximately a third of its pass routes either outdated or simply wrong. Sergeant Oswin had looked at the corrected map with the expression of a man reconsidering several years of patrol planning, and had then sat down and begun composing an urgent dispatch to regional headquarters with the focused energy of someone with a great deal to say and limited time to say it. The dispatch had gone out before dawn, carried by the garrison's fastest rider toward Valdenmoor. Whether it would arrive in time to produce reinforcements before summer was a question that Edric had filed under things he could not control and set aside, because the passes were already in front of him and he could control those. Varreth's guidance was extraordinary. Not merely in the sense of precise, though it was that, each instruction delivered with the unhurried certainty of absolute familiarity, but in the sense of complete. She knew not only the routes, but the rhythms of the terrain, where the wind came through the narrow cuts and in which direction at which hour, which rock faces collected ice in the morning and released it by midday, where the sound carried clearly and where it died. She had learned the Thornwood over years of patient attention, and the learning had not faded with the sleep. They found the column on the second day, in the high pass called Widow's Notch on the garrison maps and something considerably less poetic in Varreth's draconic notation. It was larger than either of them had hoped, not an advanced scouting party, but a substantial organized force, perhaps 300 strong, moving with the disciplined pace of professional soldiers who had calculated their timing precisely against the seasonal routes availability. Edric studied them from a ridge above the pass, flat against the cold rock, while Varreth held a thermal a quarter-mile back and used the cloud cover as concealment with the practiced ease of a creature that had been flying mountain weather for a century. 300, moving in column, lightly supplied, a strike force, not an invasion army. Fast, aimed at Caldersford, counting on the passes to give them the element of surprise. The element of surprise was something Edric was not inclined to leave them. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. Edric had 7 knights, a provisional authority, and a storm dragon whose compact had been dormant for 120 years. He also had complete knowledge of every aspect of the terrain between the column and its objective. A garrison horse with excellent nerves and a clarity of purpose. That he had found, over 34 years of varying degrees of certainty about his choices, to be the most reliable foundation for action. The Widow's Notch narrowed to a choke point 2 miles from its lower end, a place where the pass walls came within 30 feet of each other, the path between them threading over a section of rock that was passable by a column in single file and by nothing wider. Varreth told him about it on the first evening of their planning. She described the wind patterns in it, the acoustics, the way the cliff walls on either side caught weather and amplified it. She also described, with the calm specificity of someone offering operational information, what a contained lightning discharge in that space would sound like. The goal, Edric said carefully, is not to kill 300 people. The goal, Varreth agreed, is to make 300 people reconsider whether this particular pass, on this particular day, is where they wish to be. They looked at each other, the knight on the ridge and the storm dragon holding a thermal above him, with the mutual understanding of 2 parties who had over 9 days of archive work and corridor conversation, and the slow reconstruction of a century-old bond, arrived at a sufficiently complete picture of each other's judgment to trust it under pressure. "How precise can you be?" he asked. "In a contained space with wind patterns, I know." The pale eyes had the quality of something settling into its own competence. "Very." The column reached Widow's Notch at midday. They found it already occupied, not by soldiers, but by a single knight in second-order colors, standing in the center of the pass with his horse beside him, and a garrison banner planted in the rock behind him, which was, by the most optimistic reading, an extraordinarily confident gesture, and by the most practical reading, a precisely calibrated one. The column's lead officers stopped. The column behind them compressed and halted. The negotiation, such as it was, lasted approximately 4 minutes. Edric stated clearly and without theatrical embellishment that the pass ahead was under active garrison authority, that the garrison was aware of the column's approach, composition, and objective, and that the most practical course of action available to the column was a return to the eastern range, while the matter of their presence was referred to diplomatic channels. He also noted, for completeness, that the garrison's full resources were currently deployed in support of this position. The lead officer looked at the single knight, the horse, and the garrison banner, and began to form what was probably a pointed response to the claim of full garrison resources. Varreth came through the notch at full wingspan, low enough that the wingtip clearance on either side of the rock walls was measurable in feet, and discharged twice, not at the column but into the cliff faces above it, controlled and precise, each bolt leaving a new scar in the stone and sending a cascade of non-lethal but impressively sized rock fragments down the pass walls and a crack of thunder through the enclosed space that arrived in the chest, before the ears had time to process it. The negotiation concluded shortly thereafter. They stood in the pass after the column had retreated, the sound of it fading into the upper reaches of the Thornwood, moving east with the efficient pace of people who had recalculated, and the quiet of high mountain air settled back around them. Varreth landed beside Edric, her wingspan folding with the neat precision of something that had just remembered, in practice, what it was built for. The pale eyes were bright in a way they had not been when she arrived at the garrison courtyard 11 days ago. "The compact," Edric said. He had the formal renewal document in his saddlebag, drafted on the 7th evening, reviewed twice, carried through the passes in a weatherproof tube. He produced it now because the location felt right in a way that was difficult to articulate, and that he had decided not to try to articulate. "If you're willing," Varreth looked at the document. Then at the pass around them, her pass, the one she had known for a century, the one she had found again on the thread of a promise that had never quite let her go. "I came back," she said, "because I remembered that I had made a promise. Even when I couldn't remember what the promise was." She looked at him, at the order crest on his surcoat, at the garrison banner still planted in the rock behind his horse, at the particular quality of steadiness in him. That was not the absence of uncertainty, but the decision to act despite it. "I think the promise remembered itself." Edric held the compact document steady against the mountain wind. She set one careful claw to the space the document's formal terms indicated, and the act of it, the deliberateness, the intention, was its own kind of signature, witnessed by the stone walls of the notch and the sky above them, and the particular silence of high places that had seen considerable history and were not easily impressed. "Warden of the Thornwood Passes," Edric said. "Welcome back." The pale eyes held the brightness of lightning, not the violence of it, but the clarity. The thing that comes before the storm that means not destruction, but the arrival, finally, of rain. "Sir Knight," Varreth said. "It is good to remember." They descended from the pass together as the afternoon light moved long and golden across the Thornwood. The garrison banner rolled, and carried, the compact in its weatherproof tube, the mountains around them holding the deep, uncomplicated silence of terrain that has been known for a long time and is glad to be known again. The regional headquarters response arrived 3 weeks after Sergeant Oswin's dispatch, carried by a formal courier with a sealed document pouch and the expression of someone who had traveled a significant distance to deliver news of uncertain reception. The document contained, in order, a commendation for the interception of the column, a detailed set of questions about the legal basis for the compact renewal, a secondary commendation for the compact renewal itself, and, at the bottom of the packet, on a separate sheet in the regional commander's personal hand, a note that said simply, "Vane's grandfather's grandfather would have approved. So do we formalize the terms at your earliest convenience?" The formal terms took 2 months to finalize, during which time, Varreth conducted a complete survey of the Thornwood Passes that produced the most accurate cartographic record of the eastern range in the Order's history, and Edric was promoted to full garrison commander with an expanded budget, and 4 additional knights, which brought the Ashford garrison back to 11, and provided enough personnel that the inventory duties could be distributed more equitably. He still did his share. Old habits. The garrison's founding seal above the main gate was restored that autumn by a stonemason from Valdenmoor who had, after an initial period of professional adjustment, found the experience of working under the occasional supervisory gaze of a storm dragon to be, his words, surprisingly motivating in terms of attention to detail. The original carving was cleaned and reinforced, and beside it, at Varreth's suggestion and with the Order's formal approval, a second carving was added, the compact date, and below it renewed, in the angular script that matched the notation she had used on the garrison's corrected maps. Varreth had a sanctuary in the eastern wing of the garrison now, the old storage building, enlarged and modified over the winter with the help of several very cooperative stonemasons and one very specific set of measurements. She was not always there. The passes were her domain and she moved through them as she always had, with the patient thoroughness of something that had made a territory its own across years of accumulated attention. But she returned regularly, and the garrison had learned to read the particular sound of a large and familiar landing in the courtyard as simply another sound of the keep's ordinary life, the way a household learns to recognize the step of someone who belongs there. On a clear morning in the first spring after the compact's renewal, Edric stood at the garrison gate with his coffee, a habit he had developed in the city and never quite relinquished. Despite the garrison's very strongly held view, that tea was the appropriate morning beverage, and looked up at the restored seal above him. The knight and the dragon, carved in the weathered stone of 140 years, neither dominant nor submissive, simply present together. Behind him, the sound of a large, deliberate landing settled into the courtyard with the ease of something arriving home. "The North Pass is clear," Varreth said. "The seasonal melt is later than usual. The route will be viable for another 3 weeks," noted, Edric said. He didn't turn around. The morning light was doing something particular to the carving above the gate, catching the newly cleaned stone in a way that made the figures in it look, briefly and improbably, like they were in motion. "Anything else?" "The eastern boundary is quiet," a pause, with the quality of someone offering something they consider significant through the mechanism of offering. Something apparently small. "It is a good morning," Edric looked at the seal. At the knight who had been his grandfather's grandfather's commander, and the dragon who had made a promise to that knight and had kept it across a century of sleeping because promises, the real ones, did not require the person who made them to be awake. "Yes," he said. "It is." He finished his coffee. The morning continued, clear and unhurried, as mornings do when the things that are supposed to be in their places have found their way back to them. "O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não esta sozinho. Dic su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram. Escreva sua teoria nas comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo."